Fukushima accident. Accident in 2011 at the Fukushima Daiichi, No. 1, plant in northern Japan, the second worst nuclear accident after the Chernobyl disaster of 1986 in the history of nuclear power generation. The site is on Japan's Pacific coast, in northeastern Fukushima prefecture about 100 kilometers 60 miles south of Sendai. The facility, operated by the Tokyo Electric and Power Company TEPCO, was made up of 6 boiling water reactors constructed between 1971 and 1979. At the time of the accident, only reactors 1 to 3 were operational, and reactor 4 served as temporary storage for spent fuel rods. TEPCO officials reported that tsunami waves generated by the main shock of the Japan earthquake on March 11, 2011, damaged the backup generators at the Fukushima Daiichi plant. Although all 3 of the reactors that were operating were successfully shut down, the loss of power caused cooling systems to fail in each of them within the first few days of the disaster. Rising residual heat within each reactor's core caused the fuel rods in reactors 1, 2, and 3 to overheat and partially melt down, leading at times to the release of radiation. Melted material fell to the bottom of the containment vessels in reactors 1 and 2 and bored sizable holes in the floor of each vessel, a fact that emerged in late May. Those holes partially exposed the nuclear material in the cores. Explosions resulting from the buildup of pressurized hydrogen gas occurred in the outer containment buildings enclosing reactors 1 and 3 on March 12 and March 14, respectively. Workers sought to cool and stabilize the 3 cores by pumping seawater and boric acid into them. Because of concerns over possible radiation exposure, government officials established a 30-kilometer, 18-mile no-fly zone around the facility, and a land area of 20-kilometer, 12.5-mile radius around the plant, which covered nearly 600 square km, approximately 232 square miles, was evacuated. A third explosion occurred on March 15 in the building surrounding Reactor 2. At that time the explosion was thought to have damaged the containment vessel housing the fuel rods. In actuality, the explosion punched a second hole in the containment vessel. The first hole had been created earlier by melted nuclear material that passed through the bottom of the vessel. In response, government officials designated a wider zone, extending to a radius of 30 kilometers around the plant, within which residents were asked to remain indoors. The explosion, along with a fire touched off by rising temperatures in spent fuel rods stored in Reactor 4, led to the release of higher levels of radiation from the plant. In the days that followed, some 47,000 residents left their homes. Many people in areas adjacent to the 20-kilometer evacuation warning zone also prepared to leave, and workers at the plant made several attempts to cool the reactors using truck-mounted water cannons and water dropped from helicopters. Those efforts met with some success, which temporarily slowed the release of radiation. However, they were suspended several times after rising steam or smoke signaled an increased risk of radiation exposure. As workers continued their attempts to cool the reactors, the appearance of increased levels of radiation in some local food and water supplies prompted Japanese and international officials to issue warnings about their consumption. At the end of March, the evacuation zone was expanded to 30 kilometers around the plant, and ocean water near the plant was discovered to have been contaminated with high levels of iodine-131, which resulted from leakage of radioactive water through cracks in trenches and tunnels between the plant and the ocean. On April 6, plant officials announced that those cracks had been sealed, and later that month workers began to pump the irradiated water to an on-site storage building until it could be properly treated. On April 12, nuclear regulators elevated the severity level of the nuclear emergency from 5 to 7, the highest level on the scale created by the International Atomic Energy Agency, placing it in the same category as the Chernobyl accident, which had occurred in the Soviet Union in 1986. It was not until the middle of December 2011 that Japanese Prime Minister Noda Yoshihiko declared the facility stable, after the cold shutdown of the reactors was completed. As the fallout pattern became better understood, an additional corridor of land covering roughly 207 square km, 80 square miles, and stretching away from the initial 20-kilometer zone was also designated for evacuation in the months following the disaster. Months later, radiation levels remained high in the evacuation zone, and government officials remarked that the area might be uninhabitable for decades. However, they also announced that radiation levels had declined enough in some towns located just beyond the original 20-kilometer evacuation warning zone that residents could return to their homes there. Although many areas located within the 20-kilometer evacuation warning zone and the expanded zone, an area called the difficult to return zone, continued to remain off limits due to high radiation levels, officials began to allow limited activities, business activities and visitation but no lodging in other previously evacuated areas with moderately high radiation levels. Beginning in July 2013, evacuation orders were lifted in some areas characterized by lower levels of radiation both within and beyond the 20-kilometer evacuation warning zone. By March 2017, all evacuation orders in the areas outside the difficult-to-return zone, which continued to sequester some 371 square km, about 143 square miles, had been lifted. A 2016 study on the effects of the accident on fish and marine products showed that the contamination level had decreased dramatically over time, though the radioactivity of some species, especially sedentary rockfish, remained elevated within the exclusion zone. A second, but smaller, nuclear accident took place in August 2013 when approximately 330 tons, of irradiated water used in ongoing cooling operations in reactors 1, 2, and 3 was discharged into the landscape surrounding the Fukushima Daiichi facility. TEPCO officials reported that the leak was the result of an open valve in the short barrier wall that surrounded several of the tanks used in radioactive water storage. The leak was severe enough to prompt Japan's Nuclear Regulation Authority to classify it as a Level 3 nuclear incident. Sendai, city and capital, Miyagi-ken, prefecture, northern Honshu, Japan. It is situated inland of the western Pacific Ocean, the central districts lying between the Nanakita and Hirose rivers. The city is bounded to the south by the Notori River, south of which is the city of Notori, to the northeast is the port city of Shiogama, on the southwestern corner of Matsushima Bay. Sendai's original architecture was designed by a feudal lord to be the headquarters of the Date daimyo family. However, much of the old city was destroyed by aerial bombardment during World War II. Ruins of its 16th-century castle stand on Aoba Hill in the western part of the contemporary city. Now the largest city and commercial center of the Tohoku region, northeastern Honshu, Sendai is also the regional seat of federal administrative agencies. It is a rail hub but depends upon its outport of Shiogama for shipping. Sendai's international airport is in Notori City. The city's relatively few manufactures, such as kokeshi wooden dolls, are primarily for local consumption. Agriculture in the surrounding area consists of rice paddies and fruit orchards. Sendai is an educational center and the seat of Tohoku University. Sendai has one of the highest ratios of park space to city area in Japan because of its reconstruction after World War II. The Shinto shrine of Osaki Hachiman is valued for its architectural beauty. Tourists from throughout Japan are attracted to the city by the annual Tanabata Matsuri, Star Festival, August 6–8, and to nearby Matsushima Bay, portions of which are renowned for their scenery. On March 11, 2011, northern Japan was struck by a massive underwater earthquake, magnitude 9.0, centered in the Pacific about 80 miles (130 kilometers) east of Sendai. The trembler and numerous aftershocks did significant damage to the city and region, especially in prefectures south of the city. However, the worst destruction came from large tsunami waves, generated by the quake, that swept through low-lying areas of the city and penetrated several miles inland in some places. The areas inundated were largely destroyed, and, because the city's residents had so little warning before the tsunami struck, thousands of people were killed or were missing and presumed dead. Rescue efforts quickly turned largely to relief and recovery operations, as the city struggled to assist the thousands of people displaced by the disaster, repair damaged infrastructure, and restore municipal services. Now go check out the elephant's foot and what it really is.